Hello, students. This is our recorded lecture in lieu of having class on July 4th, so be sure that you listen to this lecture. I have my video shut off so I can share my screen in just a second so I can share the PowerPoint. So I'm just going to hop into it because we have a lot of material to cover for this particular lecture. Here we go. All right. So this is a module in week 8, Applied Behavior Analysis Basics. Just because there is so much information to cover this week, I am not going to spend a lot of time on the review, but last week we were talking about the learning media assessment for Ellen Doe. I will have feedback to you all by the end of this week before the weekend, so you can work on your essential assessment assignment. Little brief reminder that those are due Wednesday, July 10th at 8 a.m. Remember, you have to annotate all of the ECC, the FVA, and the LMA. Keep in mind what you did for the discussion boards. You can incorporate that into your assignment, but that is not the totality of what you need to do for each of those sections. So for example, with the ECC on the discussion board, you only had to select 2 areas, but for the actual assignment itself, you have to do the entirety of the ECC, so all of the areas. If you can, please try to submit it in one document, but it's okay if you need to do multiples. You won't get counted off for that. You do not have to annotate the introduction or the recommendation sections, and be sure that you have a narrative describing how each assessment area impacts how you work specifically with the child, caregivers, and educational professionals. And please write 1 paragraph for each area, ECC, FEA, and LMA. Those paragraphs do not have to be super, super long, but you need to have some good information within those. All right, so for your own review about the LMA, please review these slides. Talking about like the different pathways for literacy. We talked about conventional, functional, and communication and those different types of learners. We looked at the different forms last week. So keep that information in mind. And then we have supplemental tools and resources that you can use to get a fuller picture, because again, having multiple assessment tools and resources in your teacher toolbox is really critical in thinking about meeting the individual needs of each student. All right, so to kick off for tonight, I'm sure some of you saw the PowerPoint and saw that it's 71 slides, so please don't freak out when you see that. I know that's a lot of slides, but I'm going to go through a lot of this really quickly and try to hit on to the really big important topics. So just really listen carefully, really look at the PowerPoint. This will help you with the final assignment, so keep that in mind. Our big questions for tonight are all about behavior, and specifically, how do we apply this knowledge to the behaviors of students with multiple disabilities? We're also going to be talking about defining and shaping behavior tonight. All right, so behavior basics. So the development of behaviorism. So causal links between like behavior and why behavior is happening have long been observed. There's a very long history, especially in the psychology world, about why things happen the way that they do. Where most people typically start with behaviorism is with Pavlov, and if that name's familiar to you, that's the guy that trained dogs to salivate on command when they would hear a ding, because he classically conditioned them by pairing an unconditioned stimulus, which was food, with a conditioned stimulus, which was the ringing tone, to elicit a conditioned response. Behaviorism is the insistence on peer observable behavior, and it basically sets forth the theory that all behavior is conditioned. So that behavior always has a reason, and we might not be able to ascertain what that reason is immediately, but there's a reason for that behavior. Then we have B.F. Skinner, who came up with operant conditioning, which is also called instrumental conditioning. And this is something that examines relationships between behavior and consequences. And this is something that is more voluntary, whereas Pavlov, with his classical conditioning, is more of a reflexive thing that you can do. So more like with the dogs being trained to salivate with the tone, that's something that is kind of a reflex. So you're conditioned, not necessarily, with your full consent necessarily, just thinking about like an instinctual reflexive response. But operant conditioning is more what we're going to be looking at in terms of defining and shaping behavior in students. So there is a whole field of behavior called applied behavior analysis. And this is the process of applying sometimes tentative principles of behavior to the improvement of specific behaviors and simultaneously evaluating whether or not any changes noted are indeed attributed to the process of application. So basically, this is a whole very regimented way of looking at behavior where you're looking at the principles of behavior. Does it apply to a specific behavior, and evaluating any changes along the way that can be attributed to the principles of behavior. It also, applied behavior analysis also holds with the idea that we must change socially important behavior. So this is a pretty broad spectrum of a lot of things that can include all sorts of things from destructive behaviors in class, self-injurious behaviors, all sorts of things. ABA is the acronym for Applied Behavior Analysis. It's also behaviors are chosen because it needs to change, not because its study is convenient. So this is all about changing behaviors in students to improve their quality of life, to make sure they're actually being able to learn in school and those important things. And there's a whole a field of ABA. You can become an ABA specialist. There's specific classes you can do. I mean, there's all sorts of things. So this is a very, very big, important field. And we're going to be learning about some of these basic principles tonight. So this little Venn diagram is what we call the ABCs of behavior. And that stands for antecedent, or the stimulus, so the A, the behavior or the response, the B, and the consequence, or again, the stimulus, the C. So antecedent, behavior, consequence, A, B, C. The behavior is the observable action that is happening that we can see. Like, let's say it's acting out in class, like disrupting the teacher while the teacher is trying to instruct. That's the behavior that we're witnessing. The antecedent is whatever happened prior to that behavior to elicit that behavior. And then the consequence is the stimulus that comes after the behavior has happened that reinforces that behavior. So for example, if we're talking about disruptive behavior while the teacher is giving instructions to the class, the antecedent might be that the student does not want to work on the upcoming assignment because for whatever reason. So that has kicked off the behavior where they're being disruptive. And the reinforcing consequence there that continues this behavior is the teacher's giving them attention, or they've been taken out of the classroom so they no longer have to participate in the activity. So that ensures the behavior keeps happening. So these behavior chains are really important when we're talking about defining and shaping behavior in a child, because we can do things to shape the antecedent and consequence in the ABC behavior chain to shape a behavior into something that's more socially acceptable and better for the student in the classroom. All right, dimensions of behavior. So dimensions of behavior are things that describe the behavior, so the B and ABC. there are multiple different types of dimensions of behavior, and they all apply in different ways depending on what behavior we're specifically looking at with the child. So, for example, do study this little table in your free time. I would strongly, strongly recommend putting this table in your teacher toolbox, because this is a very handy, easy way of explaining dimensions of behavior and how we count data on behavior. So for example, frequency is one dimension. The definition of that is the number of times. And an example of this is a student named Corbin called out 18 times during morning meeting. Sorry, my Google Meet was acting up there. I gotta keep trying to keep going here. Okay. Dimensions of behavior. Another type is force, which is intensity. Chris tracks Braille so heavily he depresses the Braille dots. Locus is location of behavior. Marley uses the first knuckle of her right pointer finger to poke her right eye. So really study these different types: frequency, rate, duration, latency, topography, force, locus, and think about how they apply to different types of behavior, because this will help you when you're talking like to other specialists on the IEP IFSP team. This will help you when talking to families and caregivers, to administrators. You know, this is how we define what the behavior is. And you have to know, what does this behavior look like and how does it manifest, and how can I show data to explain how this is happening? So, you know, does it matter the number of times that it's occurring in the classroom? Does it matter how long the behavior lasts? Does it matter the intensity, the location of behavior? Like, all of this really matters. I'm going to skip this video because we don't really have time to watch it, but I'll try to circle back to it and see if we can watch this video later in class if we have time one day. But this was basically just to practice thinking about the dimensions of behavior and thinking about which would apply in that video. Function of behavior, describing the why of the behavior. So functions of behavior that explain why behavior occurs is basically the relationship between behavior and consequence. So in the ABC, it's the relationship between the B and the C. So behavior functions, why do they do that? These are typically the most common reasons for why students engage in a specific behavior. It's to gain attention, gain some sort of a tangible, gain sensory stimulation. And then there's the flip side of this: escape from attention, escape from anything else, or escape from sensory stimulation. So it could be a gain or an escape. When a student gets what they want, they are more likely to engage in the behavior again. And this is the power of reinforcement. So even if it's an inappropriate behavior, even if it's not the safest behavior, if it's working for that child and they're getting what they want out of it, they will continue to do it. So to receive all of your points for listening to this lecture, you are going to have to listen for the secret password, and please don't share that with your classmates. But that'll be somewhere in this lecture. And then you also need to look at slide 22 here that says your turn and answer these questions. So either consider a complex behavior you've observed in a child in any capacity. It could be a child you're related to, a child that you've taught, a child that you've observed, and think about, what were the functions of the behavior? So was it gaining attention, escape from sensory stimulation, you know, which from this list was the function of behavior? What consequences maintained the behavior, and how did changing the consequences change the behavior? So answer those 3 questions, and as well as message me. So you can just message this to me on Canvas or in an email. But answer these 3 questions and give me the secret password, and you will get your full credit for this class and this lecture. Okay, Arranging consequences to change behavior. So, views of behavior in children. So there's kind of two ways that people tend to look at problem behaviors. So either folks tend to say that the child themselves is a problem or that the child has a problem. And these are very, very different ways of looking at it, and thinking about what a child is responsible for. And in my opinion, the perspective of that the child themselves is a problem, is very problematic itself. I truly believe, there's no such thing as like a bad kid. We see some bad behaviors or behaviors that we don't like. But, you know, I'd say 9 times out of 10, the child's not being malicious. Like there is an actual like purpose and meaning and some kind of something that they're getting out of demonstrating that behavior. And it's up to us to kind of figure out those antecedents and consequences to see why that behavior is happening and what we can do to shape it. I think it's also really problematic to say that the child is a problem, because it gives a very negative connotation to the child themselves, and it makes adults interact with them in a different way. So it's more if we think about, okay, the behavior itself is what the problem is, then we can tackle that as a responsibility to making sure the child is able to participate in the classroom. And I think keeping that in mind is really important. Okay, functional behavior assessments, FBA. This is something that is legally required by IDEA if the behavior in the classroom is impeding learning of the child or those around them. With an FBA, this is typically something that is either conducted by like a school psychologist or a behavior specialist or like an ABA therapist or specialist. But typically positive behavior strategies are the default. So this is talking about like positive reinforcement. Any professional or caregiver can examine the behaviors, antecedents, and consequences. So this needs to be like a team discussion, multiple observations, kind of the usual that we talk about with these assessments. A behavior specialist in these cases is necessary for behaviors related to disability areas and behaviors that interfere with academic progress. And a formal FBA and behavior intervention plan, BIP, should be written into the IEP and implemented by an expert. So these are all really important things to kind of keep in mind about what an FBA is. So it's all about just like figuring out the ABCs for that kiddo, the antecedent behavior consequence, and figuring out like how best to support that child. So just as a little reminder, antecedent behavior consequence, and a consequence can be reinforcement or punishment, depending, and we'll be talking about that in just a second. So consequences, we have reinforcement and punishment. Reinforcement is a consequence that increases a behavior, and punishment is a consequence that reduces the behavior. And this is a handy little table to help you guys remember the types of consequences. So positive reinforcement is something that you add to increase a behavior. Negative reinforcement is something that you take away to increase a behavior. Positive punishment is when you add something to decrease a behavior. And a negative punishment is when you take away something to decrease a behavior. So for like a positive reinforcement, adding to increase, that's like saying, I will give you extra recess time if you can sit quietly to do this assignment. So you're increasing the on-task behavior by adding a positive reinforcement. So this is basically how this works. All right. So arranging consequences to increase behavior. So why are we using reinforcement to increase behavior? So first and foremost, we always need to consider increasing positive behaviors before punishing bad behaviors. Always reinforcement before punishment. Reinforcement also places the control in the adult's hands because then we are helping shape that behavior that helps the child. Otherwise, we're just decreasing problematic behavior and not teaching alternatives. And this is the really big difference between reinforcement and punishment. Punishment just decreases a problem behavior, but isn't helping them to learn an alternative behavior instead of the problem behavior or increasing a good behavior. So that's why reinforcement is a superior thing to use to increase behavior. Reinforcement is also good because it teaches the behaviors the child should be demonstrating. And kind of think about it this way, what's better, less yelling or more on task work? So thinking about and being really mindful about what we're choosing and why. Okay. Positive reinforcer defined. This is something that increases or maintains the future rate or probability of occurrence of a behavior. It is administered contingent upon the production of a desired or requested behavior and is administered immediately following the production of the desired or requested behavior. So basically, we are increasing and or maintaining the likelihood that a behavior that we want to see is happening. A positive reinforcer is something that happens when the desired or requested behavior occurs, and you have to administer it immediately upon seeing the desired or requested behavior. Okay, so slide 32, these are types of reinforcers. Again, I would tuck this into your teacher toolbox and think about what these are, how we use them. But these are types of reinforcers. There's primary reinforcers, which are the most powerful of reinforcers, and then secondary reinforcers, which can be helpful but are not quite as impactful as primary reinforcers. So under primary reinforcers, we have edible reinforcers. Those can be a little controversial, using like foodstuffs to help elicit a behavior that we want, because A, those are not naturally occurring, B, they're not always appropriate in the moment, and C, if you are using edible reinforcers and a child gets full and no longer is hungry or wants a reinforcer, then you no longer have something powerful to elicit the behavior that you want. So there are positives and negatives with edible reinforcers. Also under sensory reinforcers are, primary reinforcers are sensory reinforcers. So visual, auditory, tactile, olfactory, kinesthetic, those can be really powerful, especially when we're thinking about this particular population of students that we've been talking about all semester. Sensory reinforcers can be really huge. Secondary reinforcers include tangible or material reinforcers like stickers, badges, certificates, balloons. Privilege reinforcers, activity reinforcers, generalized reinforcers, which includes like token systems, points, credits, and then social reinforcers. So expressions, proximity, contact, words and phrases, feedback, seating arrangements. So that can include getting a high five from your teacher. It can include getting to sit by a preferred friend in the classroom. So all of these, when used appropriately, can be very powerful. So keep it varied, figure out what works best for your students. The main difference between the primary and secondary reinforcers, primary are motivating because they're biological. They are natural, unlearned, and unconditioned. They can change behavior very quickly. However, they also can be perceived as insulting or manipulative, depending on the circumstances. So be careful about that. And another difficult thing with primary reinforcers, like we talked about, was students must need the reinforcer for it to change the behavior. So if you're using an edible, they have to be hungry in order for that to work. Secondary reinforcers, ideally, you want to really focus on these because they help promote intrinsic motivation, which is ultimately what we want to encourage with kids for behavior. So eventually you want them to replace primary reinforcers if you can and if it's appropriate. They include social stimuli, symbolic representations. Keep in mind that their value is something that has to be learned or conditioned. So this is something you have to explicitly teach. And children may have to be taught value or secondary reinforcers just as a general concept. So, we might have kiddos that don't understand like a point system, or that you do this and earn a reward later. Those are concepts that have to be taught. Contingent reinforcer. So contingency is really critical. If the child doesn't change the behavior and you give the reinforcer anyway, then you're reinforcing a different behavior. Always follow if-then statements. This is very common in classrooms, especially working with this population of kids, to see if-then boards. So, or first-then boards. So first we are going to go to the math center, and then we're going to have a sensory break, whatever the case is. So another example, if you put your toys away, then you can play outside. If the child doesn't put away toys and you still let the child play outside, you just increase the likelihood the child won't put away toys in the future. So keep that in mind. Immediate reinforcers. Waiting diminishes the relationship between the behavior and the consequence. So if you wait, you might end up reinforcing a different behavior. You can create a schedule of reinforcement to delay reinforcement, but that is systematically arranged. So example, if you put away your toys and you can play outside, you turn your back to tend to dinner, the child hits his sister and then puts up the toys. You don't notice, but you see the toys are put up and let the child play outside. You've just increased the likelihood the child will hit his sister again. So be really mindful about how you are giving reinforcers. And that leads us to schedules of reinforcement. So this is all about patterns of timing of delivery of reinforcement. Why don't we just always reinforce immediately? Well, it's not always practical, and we do also want students to learn that you don't get instant gratification all of the time whenever you're doing a good behavior. So one way of doing this is continuous schedule of reinforcement, which is lots of reinforcement relative to performance. So this is basically just giving a reinforcement immediately every time the child demonstrates the behavior that you want them to have. Pros of this, this typically leads to high rates of response. It gives more opportunities for practice and learning, and is quite useful when learning new behaviors. Drawbacks of this, students can become satiated on a reinforcer, which is especially likely with primary reinforcers, so then the reinforcer stops working. Students may come to expect a reinforcement for each response and not give the behavior unless they get the reinforcement, which is a problem. Because this becomes not efficient because you remove the reinforcer, then the behavior decreases. So then we have intermittent schedule of reinforcement, where we reinforce some, but not all correct behaviors. This helps delay satiation. It's more resistant to extinction, extinction is when we are like totally trying to get rid of a behavior. So you don't want a behavior that we want to see to go into extinction. And students learn to delay gratification, which is a really important thing. So there's two major types of this. There's ratio, the number of times a behavior occurs to determine the timing of reinforcement. So for example, you do the behavior 5 times, then you get your reinforcer. Or intervals, which is the occurrence of at least one correct or appropriate response plus the passage of a specific amount of time. So you do the behavior, and then 30 minutes later, you get your reinforcer. So typically what I often recommend when we are starting a new behavior, we start out with continuous schedule of reinforcement where we're reinforcing it every time. So the child is learning that that is the desired behavior. And then we slowly fade into intermittent reinforcement to maintain the behavior. So using a combination of these things can be really important. So response duration schedules is also another one. This is when a behavior must be performed for a specific duration to receive reinforcement. And then reinforcement is delivered at the end of duration. So an example, I have to sit quietly for 3 minutes to earn recess. This little figure is schedules for delivery of reinforcement, thinking about thinning reinforcement. And it basically just shows you really dense reinforcement as opposed to really sparse reinforcement. So continuous reinforcement schedule is obviously the most dense. And then the next dense is intermittent, and then ratio, interval, and response duration schedules, and then non-scheduled delivery of reinforcement, which is more naturally occurring. Ideally, you want to move towards less frequent reinforcement. We want to see high rates of behavior, removal of behavior monitor. We want kids to self-regulate, and natural reinforcement when possible, because ideally, you want the child to have the behavior and demonstrate it, in lots of different places, not just in a specific circumstance where they only do it with you as their teacher in the classroom at this specific time because you give them a specific reinforcer. You want things to happen naturally so that they're always demonstrating appropriate behaviors. Negative reinforcement, on the other hand, is a removal of an aversive stimulus immediately following a response that increases future rate of the response. It's often used accidentally when teachers misunderstand what is aversive for students. So an example of this is when a student is removed from class for misbehaving during a difficult math test. Instead, teach more appropriate ways to escape. I need a break. Ask for help. Consider safer, more appropriate alternative behaviors. All right. Arranging consequences to decrease behavior. So all that stuff we talked about, reinforcement, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, that's increasing behaviors. So remember, reinforcement increases behavior. Punishment is a consequence that reduces behavior. So ways to reduce behavior. There are reinforcement-based strategies, which is reinforcement of alternatives. Extinction, which is terminating the reinforcement completely. Removal of desirable stimuli or presentation of aversive stimuli, and those two are technically considered punishments. So why is extinction such a problem? Because again, looking at this, level 2 here in this procedural alternative for behavior reduction is extinction, where we terminate a reinforcement. Why is this so hard? So basically, let's say you have figured out that a child is acting out because they don't want to be in the classroom attending to a test or an activity or whatever the case is. But every time they act out, you send them to the principal's office, and that is reinforcing the behavior because they get out of the classroom. And so it's reinforcing the behavior. So you have decided you're going to extinct the reinforcer. You've decided that no more are we going to send you out of the classroom. We're just going to deal with the behaviors. What's really tricky about extinction with a reinforcer for shaping a behavior, typically there's a delayed reaction. And there's also an increase initially in the rate of the undesired behavior. So we call that an extinction burst, where the child rapidly increases the behavior that you don't want to see, in an effort to regain the reinforcer they were previously getting. What's also difficult with extinction is sometimes there's something called spontaneous recovery, where they'll backslide and go back into the undesired behavior. What's really hard about this is sometimes it's a reinforcer that we have limited control over. So it could be something that's being reinforced by others. Extinction also makes it difficult to generalize a behavior. And then in particular, sensory extinction is unique and really hard to work with because of the complexity with sensory stimulation. So looking again at the procedural alternatives for behavior reduction, ways to reduce behavior. If we look at removal of desirable stimuli, this is considered negative reinforcer, where we're removing reinforcers or the student themselves is removed with response cost procedures and timeout procedures. Presentation of aversive stimuli is technically a positive punishment, where we have unconditioned aversive stimuli that could be pain, conditioned aversive stimuli, yelling, overcorrection procedures, writing lines, cleaning all the tables, and those sorts of things. Again, I'm not telling you these things because I believe you should use these types of punishments, but more that I'm explaining that these are options out there and they can be used appropriately, but should be used sparingly. So punishment defined, this is something that decreases the future rate or probability of occurrence of a behavior. It's administered contingent upon the production of an undesired or inappropriate behavior and is administered immediately following the production of the undesired or inappropriate behavior. So some disadvantages of punishment. It does not teach the correct behavior. You're just decreasing the incorrect behavior. Can lead to exclusion and abuse because, again, you just have to be really careful with punishment, and it can be difficult to administer correctly. So before we try punishment, fully document all of your attempts to use reinforcement. Seek help from professionals, the IEP team, an ABA specialist. Have a clear, considered plan administered by professionals. Punishment is not something that should be done lightly. Like, it needs to be very thoughtfully considered and basically like as a last resort that's used in tandem with positive and negative reinforcement. So, something to think about, this little case that we have here. The hypothesis evolving from a functional assessment is that Kalvik engages in self-injurious behaviors to escape tasks with significant motor demands. Ms. Parker decides to redirect Kalvik's hands to task materials each time his hand rises above his shoulder. He is reinforced each time he touches the material. After 6 days of this intervention, Kalvik's self-injurious behaviors were not decreasing. So think about this for just a second. What do you think is wrong here? Clearly, the intervention's not working. So the antecedent and the consequence identified are clearly incorrect. So they need to go back to the drawing board, do some observations, and refigure out this behavior intervention plan. So here's another one, clowning around. Bart, the self-proclaimed class clown, makes ongoing comments about each student's reading as they take turns reading orally. It becomes more and more disruptive as students giggle, hiss, and talk back. The teacher sees that scolding Bart is not producing noticeable results. She decides to put the behavior on extinction, but the behavior does not decrease with this strategy either. The problem here is the teacher thinks if she just ignores it, that Bart will decrease the behavior. The teacher's not the one that's reinforcing this behavior. It's all the other students that are giggling and talking, and they're the ones that are reinforcing Bart's behavior. So the identified consequence is incorrect in the ABC behavior change. So they need to make an alternative behavior plan for this student. All right. Antecedent control and shaping. So antecedent control is the relationship between the antecedent and behavior, the A and the B of the ABC behavior chain. Response prompting instructional strategies. So this is used to increase the occurrence of a target behavior, which increases the likelihood of the behavior that will be reinforced, which increases the likelihood that the behavior reoccurs. So the antecedent occurs before the behavior. They set the scene for the desired behavior. Examples of this could be physical assistance, verbal directions, and modeling behavior. Prompting hierarchies are really important in this particular, with regard to antecedents. Prompting hierarchies are changes in the type of prompt delivered. So a system of least prompts is where you would start with the least intrusive and move to most intrusive if necessary to teach skills. This often increases efficacy of a previously learned skill and typically is very highly structured. Another type is most to least prompts, where we start with the most intrusive and move to least intrusive as skills are acquired, often used to teach new skills, and again, typically highly structured. And then we have graduated guidance. Historically, this is physical prompting and it's flexibly reduced over time. So least to most, you might start with a verbal prompt and end with a full physical prompt to help remind students how to do an already learned skill. Most to least prompts is when we're learning a new skill where we might start with a full physical prompt and gradually back off to a verbal prompt. So it goes full physical prompt, partial physical prompt, modeling, gesture, verbal prompt. So that's most to least, and then least to most would just be the opposite of that. Response prompting timing, we have simultaneous prompting, which is errorless learning, where you give the prompt at the time of the behavior. So you give the direction and prompt the correct response at the same time. So you have just like one choice. They know, you tell the student, okay, select the answer to this question, touch the card, and that's the prompt and the direction at the same time. Then we have time delay, which is a time between the stimulus and the prompt. So between the antecedent and the prompt for the behavior, where you give the direction, wait the specified time, and then prompt the correct response. And there's two different types, main types of this: constant time delay and progressive time delay. From Vanderbilt University, there's a lot of really great constant time delay interventions that have been put in place for teaching Braille contractions or like doing Braille contraction refreshers. And I will post a couple of links on Canvas for you guys to check some of that out. So these are evidence-based practices. Constant time delay is, as of 2014, 4 studies met the standards without reservations and 8 met with reservations across 8 independent research groups and 57 replications of effect. So using response prompting in a systematic way with children with little functional vision is an evidence-based practice per the 2005 Horner guidelines. So that's a really, really big deal because we don't have very many evidence-based practices in our field. In a sense, then, response prompting is the only documented evidence-based practice for children who are blind. So that's a really big deal for making a case for using response prompting with children with visual impairments. When we're talking about the differences between evidence-based practices versus best or recommended practices versus research-based practices, these 3 terms are used very interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. The highest standard quality is evidence-based practices. And again, only response prompting is one that we have for students with visual impairments. All evidence-based practices are also research-based practices, but not all research-based practices are evidence-based practices. What we have the most of that we typically see are best or recommended practices, which are typically supported with anecdotal data. Um, Evidence-based practices are not best or recommended practices, but some research-based practices can be best or recommended practices. So that little visual there with the Venn diagrams kind of shows you the interrelationships between these terms, but don't use these interchangeably. Be mindful, pick the correct term when you're talking about these. So, when we're talking about using prompting, ideally, we don't want students to get overly reliant on prompting and only use prompting to elicit a behavior. So eventually we want to fade the prompting. So some keys to doing this: prompts should focus attention and not distract the student. Prompts, as appropriate and as often as possible, should be as weak as possible. So you don't want to just full bore always use the most intrusive, most intense prompt. You want to use the one that elicits the most independence as possible. Prompts should always be faded as quickly as possible, and prompts should follow a plan. Don't prompt spontaneously. So make sure you're following a plan really carefully in place, and you're not just flying by the seat of your pants prompting whenever, because that's really, really not a good practice to get into. So when we're shaping more complex behaviors, we want to make sure that we are doing a task analysis that lays out every single step, and we think very mindfully about how we're supporting each of those steps with what type of prompting. We want to consider chaining forward, backward, or the totality of the task, how it makes sense to really break down the behavior, and using different types of reinforcement and figuring out how that's best used to reinforce each step of the complex behavior. Generalization is something that typically gets knocked by the wayside, but it's really important. A generalized behavior is something that persists over time. It occurs in other settings and occurs across behaviors. And this is very, very important. And you need to be really mindful about this. And you need to always think about when we are shaping a behavior, when we are teaching a behavior, when we are writing a task analysis for a behavior, whatever the case is, you need to always consider generalization. We teach generalization so students can be successful without us being right there to prompt them and support them. We want to reduce the level of support and impact of variable support, and we want to reduce the level of artificial circumstances. We want natural reinforcement. We want them to be able to independently do the behavior. Some strategies for generalization. We have train and hope, which is unplanned generalization. I don't typically recommend that one. Sequence modification, where we use the same techniques in different settings, often used with single case research. We teach skills with naturally maintaining contingencies, so we teach functional, meaningful skills. Remember, that's especially important for this population of kids we've been talking about this semester, the functional, meaningful part. We teach sufficient exemplars, where we give lots of examples. We teach loosely, where we're teaching naturally and flexibly, not rigidly. We use indiscriminable contingencies, so we're using very intermittent reinforcement that is hard sometimes to figure out, so I don't always recommend that one. Program common stimuli, so make stimuli used match generalizing environment. That's really great for natural reinforcement. And mediate generalization and train to generalize, where we're reinforcing generalization. So what is self-management? This is where we are moving behavioral control away from us as the teachers and putting the onus on the students themselves. We are prompting students to think about their own behaviors, and this is also a type of response prompting. So this takes place, that antecedent control between antecedent and behavior. Why do we teach self-management? Self-management is an ECC skill. This falls under the self-determination category. It's very important. This is something that we can teach quickly. collecting data takes time, but it doesn't have to be super extensive. And self-management, like generalization, allows students to be independent without the teacher present, which again is always the goal, as much independence as possible. So it's really hard for me to have you guys practice observing behaviors since we're not in class together. I'll try to make some time for us to do this, but if you want to check out some of these videos, this is a really nice video from Project Slate where the student Kathy is making a choice. Just some questions to kind of consider, not just with that video, but also just when we're thinking about behavior with a specific student in general. What is the targeted behavior? Use the dimensions of behavior to operationally define. Super, super critical. What are the functions of behavior? What role is the setting playing? What are the antecedents and consequences? We want to develop an intervention hypothesis. So if we change this, then this will either increase or decrease. That is the basics of a functional behavior assessment. And then the basics of a behavioral intervention plan include what alternative behaviors might be taught. We need to operationalize a few. So change the antecedent consequences or give alternative. How do we test the hypothesis, and how do we plan to evaluate the effectiveness of the intervention? All right. So the discussion board for this week, this upcoming week, after the LMA discussion board. So this is the week 8 discussion board. Watch, consider, and describe. Operationally define a behavior to change. What is or are the functions of behavior? What role is the setting playing? Again, we're just moving through all of these questions. So think really, really hard about these. Think deeply, think meaningfully, think functionally. Okay, so we talked today about defining and shaping behavior and thinking about how to apply this knowledge to the behaviors of students with multiple disabilities. So thinking about like response prompting hierarchies, being mindful about the things that we're choosing and being really thoughtful about that and shaping behaviors. Upcoming this week, post your initial post to the discussion board by Monday, July 8th at 8 a.m. Respond to 2 of your classmates by Thursday at 8 a.m. That's July 11th. Remember that your annotated essential assessments are due on July 10th at 8 a.m., which is Wednesday. By Thursday, also complete your readings for week 9, your instructional schedules. We'll be going over that next week. Next week. As always, if you have any questions or need anything, please keep that in mind. I will say the secret password is chocolate chip cookie. Also remember to answer those questions from slide 22 to get your full participation points. If you need anything at all, just don't hesitate to reach out with a message. Thank you for listening to the lecture, and I'll see you guys in class next week. Thank you.